Okay, looks like we're going here. So I am happy to be joined by Justin Jacobs of Debug Your Brain, who is a great YouTube activist, also an activist now that does like street activism. Um, Justin, it's so great to meet you, and you're also a fellow North Carolina activist as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Happy to be here. I know we've chatted quite a bit offline from time to time, so nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you like I'm from the Triangle area, and I noticed some of the locations that you were doing your activism in, Duke University,
Mhm.
UNC Chapel Hill. So I've been following your activism for a while, and you've done a lot of street outreach videos, and a lot of those were on college campuses. And I know you just
Mhm.
recently were working with allied scholars, so you have a lot of experience on college campuses. How is that different from just like your street activism? Is there a difference when you're doing college campuses?
Yes.
Mm,
Again, this is going to be very anecdotal. I don't, I didn't do a double-blind control
mhm,
study on this. It does seem that generally speaking, college students tend to be more open-minded. They tend to give more thoughtful answers, and they also tend to be a little more keyed into like specific like current issues. Like when I talk to a random adult on the street, a lot of times like they're not really like they're not so keyed into like the integrations with like climate change and whatever you're eating, more so health, I guess. Maybe that's just a function of age because people who are more in their like 30s, 40s, 50s, they like kind of know a little bit more that like plant-based eating is healthy, whereas when you're talking to college kids, they don't really care about health at all. And so they're more like, "Oh yeah, it's really bad for the environment," because, that's obviously an anxiety for younger people, more so than older people. So that's one thing I would say is I do feel like they're probably a little more open-minded. They're a little more keyed in on environmental stuff. Sometimes I will address them differently. I do tend to,
mhm.
or at least what I tended to do in this recent ASAP tour, is I tried to like kind of use the fact that they went to college as part of my activism, like that they were in college, and specifically that the place that I was at was University of Pennsylvania, which for those who don't know is like one of like the top Ivy League schools in the United States, and the United States obviously already known for having really good universities. So one of the top universities just in the entire world. And so, when people would say things like, because one of the objections you'll get is, well, I don't make that much of a difference or whatever. I'm just one person. And so I kind of leveraged, the like I forget the martial art where you use the person's weight against them. I kind
Mm,
of leverage that like listen, you're obviously very smart. You're obviously very ambitious. You got into UPenn. You know what I mean? You're in one
mhm,
of the richest countries in the world and one of the best universities in the world. Like if you can't make a difference, who can? Like who
mhm.
are we waiting for if you're not going to do something about it? You're gonna be in jobs in positions of power that other people just don't have access to, you know. And so I could kind of like leverage and use that on a college campus. Whereas if I'm just talking to someone on the street, I can't necessarily say that. I can say like maybe I can say you're in the richest country in the world or something, but I can't be like you're at the most elite institution, in the United States. So that's kind of a like one thing I'll play with depending on like where I am, to actually cater the message to my audience.
Well, yeah, when it comes to veganism and animal rights, one of the things that I think resonates well is just this feeling of empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was pre-vegan,
Mm-hmm.
I consider myself an environmentalist, and I felt
Mm-hmm.
very powerless to do anything about that. I mean, I even remember like when I used to work in radio, like I remember sneaking into my radio station late at night just to change the light bulbs out. Like that's how
Oh
obsessed
wow.
I was.
Yeah.
Like just change them out with LED
Yeah.
bulbs. Um, and like imagine what a minuscule little difference that makes. Now I believe
Mm-hmm.
like any small difference makes, is powerful.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so learning about the environmental impact of what happens to animals, and um, it actually made me feel really empowered. So when people feel like they don't have power to change
Mm-hmm.
anything, I'm like, you pay for your food 3 times a day. How much more
Yeah.
powerful is your money? And
Yeah.
yeah, like you said at UPenn, I imagine you get a mix of like really brilliant people and also people with means,
Yeah.
wealth. perhaps, so money goes a long way. So yeah, that's really interesting. Like what do you find has been one of the more effective ways to outreach to these students?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all humans are actually quite similar. And so, for the most part, effective outreach just transcends, uh, most human experience. Well,
Hmm.
and I should say, like, obviously, I've only ever done outreach in the U.S., so I don't know if like Western cultures versus non-Western cultures there would be some things, some major differences there. But even then, I guess that there are just some universals. And so, I I focus more on like the form, the
Hmm.
like of the activism than the exact content. Now I do have a very specific content I go through for very specific reasons, but I think presenting a bunch of different content can all work. But I think what you want to do is embody certain principles of communication, and some of those are just sort of like kind of generic sounding. So like listen
Hmm.
more, talk less. It's one of the big things I say. Just listen more, talk less. Ask the person questions and then ask them a follow-up question and then ask them a follow-up question if you can. Sometimes you can't, obviously. Sometimes you have to just say, oh no, that's, I understand why you think that, but da 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 da, this is what really happens.
Hmm.
But a lot of times you can actually just get there with questions and letting them sort of like walk it out themselves. So I would say like, talk less, listen more. Try not to interrupt them. Sometimes it's inevitable, but like really trying to let them finish completely before you say your thing will just definitely make them feel more heard. Building a little bit of rapport, particularly in the beginning of the conversation. Like before the conversation even starts, I usually like ask them a couple questions like, "Oh, you're from around here? Oh, cool. I'm also from Durham." Like building commonality and rapport. So anything I can like latch onto and be like, "We're the same. Like you and I have this in common."
Hmm.
So that I'm seen as less of an other. Because if people see you as an other, they're really much more resistant to the message. Where if you can get a couple like commonalities in there, they feel more like related to you. So I try to find some commonalities. I try to build some rapport. I often ask them like, "What are you passionate about?" And that question, "What are you passionate about?" often evokes like something that's core to their values. Like if I just say like, "What's your job?" Many people have jobs that like don't super align with their values, or they're just doing it to make money, or it's like whatever,
Hmm.
or even like a hobby. Like if they're like, "Oh, I like to play basketball." If I ask someone what they're passionate about, they oftentimes don't say that so much. They talk about things that are part of their values. Like people will say, I really enjoy helping children out. I'm an educator, and I really want, the youth to be better off than I was. Or someone recently said, like, I really value being a good friend, like having good relations with other people,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know. And those things like tell me a lot about the person, and so I can. A lot of times I'll be like, wow, that's really awesome. Like, because I want to hear something good about them, because a lot of us are thinking like, how do we manage the other person's emotions? Like most of us know all the like the vegan debunks, right? The like
Hmm.
50 vegan debunks, most of us know those. And then so the next step is often people are like, well, I'm trying to manage their emotions, right? And building rapport, that's a great way to do it. Finding commonality. But I like to find something that I like about them, because the other person's emotions who you have to manage are your own. And if you feel a connection to this person, if you feel like maybe you like them, like there's a redeeming quality, then when they start like saying these, when they get defensive or they say these excuses we've heard 1,000 times, then I'm less likely to be filled with that rage or that annoyance or that just boredom. Like, here we go again. Because I can remember,
Hmm.
oh, I remember they really like to help people. They're like, they really find relations important or whatever. And so I can bring that back and I'm like, I know that you really like to help people. Like, so, why not apply that to animals? Animals can feel, they can have emotions, they have personalities, you know. And so part of it is to keep myself calm, to find something like some redemptive value in them. And part of it is to also have something later to maybe like latch onto, and I can kind of like move the conversation in a way that is like maybe relevant to their values.
So I've never really seen you lose your cool at all. Like, so are there videos that you've made that you're like, oh, I can't post this one because it just didn't go well?
Yeah, so okay, so the videos I don't post fall into a couple categories. So some of them are just kind of boring, like
Mm.
or they're like experimental. Like some of them I just was like, I'm gonna really, really listen and like try not to say too much and just like ask questions. And I had some like conversations go like an hour and a half long or like
Mm.
45 minutes long, and like I'm just like I'm not going to post those. I'm not going to edit them. They just kind of are too, too like unwatchable, I
Yeah.
guess.
Hmm.
Then there's other ones that are very short. Like a person is like, oh, I didn't want to do this. Like, they get scared once they realize what it's
Hmm.
about, and then they bounce. And so sometimes I don't really do those. Sometimes I'll integrate them in other videos just to like kind of show this person leaving, but then I'll do like 2 interviews in one.
Hmm.
And then the other one is some of them. Well, there was really only, yeah, there's one video that I haven't posted where it's as close to losing my cool as I've come, and where I was getting like kind of snippy with the person, like
Hmm.
they were just like biting so many bullets. Like, I think, what was the question I asked them? Like, oh, I think I asked them like, okay, like if a it got to the you know how these conversations go, but it got to the point where I'm just like throwing out every hypothetical, like testing the principle that they're espousing and being like, do you really hold this principle? And I was like,
Hmm.
okay, if there was like another like group of humans or like an alien race and they were coming down and literally killing all of us, like genociding us because they were more powerful than us, would you think like, okay, that's totally fine, that's all right because they have more power than us? And the person was like, yeah, I would. I think that's okay, actually.
Oh, wow.
And at
Yeah.
that point I was like, and like, I could have tried to bring them back down and been like, hey, look, I just want to tell you, like, I'm not trying to attack you. That's not the point of me asking these questions. I'm trying to get at those principles because it's very easy to just say, to say, yes, I believe this, because if you don't, it might lead to the fact that maybe you should be vegan. And so I'm not trying
Hmm.
to attack you here. I am trying to have a conversation. I know it can get heated. I didn't do that. She said that, and I was like, wow, it's a hot take. That's a really spicy take. All right, have a good one. You know what I mean? And I was getting kind of
Yeah.
like, just like my tone was like, fuck off, basically.
Hmm.
Can I curse?
Yeah, yeah, I think
Okay.
so. I don't know actually. Yeah, but you've been at this longer than me, so.
Yeah. So yeah, that was kind of like, in my tone and body language, like I had gotten to that point with this person where I was just like,
Hmm.
what are you doing? But yeah, I haven't really lost my cool too often, honestly. It's
Yeah.
very rare.
Well, I want to ask you more about the how, but
Mm,
before I do that, maybe I should ask you the why,
mm,
because there's a lot of activists who, um, in the world that I inhabit now, it's a world that's more focused on systemic change, and
mm,
at times they're more like almost snubbing their nose at the idea of individual change, not
mm,
not in like a condescending way, but in a way
mm,
that's like we don't, like this isn't the way to go. What do you
mm,
think? Because to me, like you can't change the system without changing the individuals.
mm.
Um, but I just want to get your take on that. Why this approach that you've chosen?
Yes. So yeah, a lot of reasons. So, well, I guess in some ways I just have a proclivity for it. So like, like maybe someone's like, hey, the real thing you got to go after is you need to like, change the laws, or go and talk to like, politicians and things like that. And yeah, I mean, I think those are things that we should be doing. I don't like doing that. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so like, I think, a movement is an ecosystem of approaches and of individuals who are trying to affect change. And the one thing to consider is like, what is the most effective, but another thing to consider is like, what are you actually good at? And so like, if if doing graffiti art was actually the most effective way, let's say like that was the most effective way to affect change, I still wouldn't do graffiti art because I suck at it. You know what I mean? And so part of it is aligning just like my inclinations and natural skill set with a certain approach. Having said that, though, it's like you said, you can't really change the system without changing at least some of the individuals in it, right? And at this point, we don't have enough individuals to really do the full systemic change that we want. And so until we get to some like threshold, I think this is like a really valuable thing to be doing, is to, be talking to individuals. Because it's like, so many people, they don't know that, cows produce milk because they have babies. Or if they do know that, they don't realize that the baby is taken away from the mother cow right away. There's just so many facts that just have to be laid out that people aren't even aware of. Like a lot of,
Yeah.
I don't know, big issues. Like people understand that burning oil is bad for the environment. They understand that plastic is bad for the environment. They know that coal, and they know these things are tend to be bad, and like solar and wind tend to be good, and they know like at least like a lot of these broad strokes. But with animal
Hmm.
agriculture, like they don't even know some of the most basic things. Like they don't know that most pigs are put into gas chambers. Like that's just like it happens so commonly, and yet no one knows about it. And
Yeah.
so I think that educational component right now is still extremely important. Um, what else did I want to say? So like,
Well, let me,
yeah,
yeah, I want to say too, like, I just think that, if outreach was useless or whatever, then I wouldn't be here. I think
yeah,
about the person who talked to me in a bar. Essentially, she did what you do.
mm,
She did the outreach on me. And you never know who you're talking to. Like, you could be talking to somebody who goes on to become a really powerful activist for all
mm,
you know. Or they could be, who knows, like the son of a politician or a politician themselves, or,
yes,
so that's another thing that I would throw on there as well.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And like, this is the thing too. Is like, okay, if you are an individual activist just going out and talking to someone, I guess we could kind of frame that as individual change. But so many of these activists now, like, and myself included, myself, Natalie, and a bunch of the people we were just talking about for the show, like they're making content, and so it's not just that person you talk to; it's then everyone who sees that content. And
Yeah.
so like it's this multiplier effect. It's not like I'm just going out and talking to three people and that's it. You know what I mean? And there's further. And so for me, like what I kind of focused on with my channel was actually not just talking to people, but kind of helping other activists get active. Like maybe describing like this is why I'm doing this, and then I have a video about how to get active, the microphone you want to buy, just like sort of just general tips and tricks for if you're going out solo. And I've had a bunch of people come to me and be like, "Oh, I got active because of you,"
Hmm.
or like you were part of the reason I got active. And not only that, but some of these people also then made YouTube channels themselves. And so the multiplier effect, like we were talking about, like a politician, the multiplier effect there can just get huge, right? If I if I convince someone and then they start, and I'm convincing a bunch of people with my videos, and then they become an activist, they start talking to like 10 people a week, they're going to convince some of those people, but then they start making videos and then people watch their videos and get convinced by that. You know what I mean? And you just
Hmm.
have these, yeah, you have these like knock-on effects that could actually be quite big. So that's definitely another thing to consider. But something else here, I've spoken with this about like with Catherine Klein before too, and just like the borders between individual and systemic change, I think are quite porous. Like people think of these as these totally separate entities, but like if someone's like, well, I'm more concerned about systemic change. I actually did a kind of like sort of sarcastic Instagram reel on this, and it's like someone says, I'm actually more about systemic change. Like I don't really think individual change matters. It's like, okay, well, cool. Like we're doing a fur protest next week. Do you want to come with that? Come to us with that instead. And the person's like, I don't know. It seems a little extreme. It's like, okay, well, you know, you can also just donate money to like animal charities, like this. You can donate money to ASAP, actually. Allied Scholars. Like, ooh,
Hmm.
money's a little tight right now, And you start going down
Hmm.
the line and saying that would you want to come to this animal rights march? And it's like, oh, I don't know, that's kind of weird, like marching. I'm not really big in it. And it's like these people who I think oftentimes will say something like, or at least when I'm talking to non-vegans and they say individual change like doesn't matter, it's systemic change. When you ask them to go do some sort of systemic change, oftentimes they still say no, because it still is an individual action to go and make that systemic change. You know what I mean? And
Right.
that's why I say like the borders between these two things are more porous than we often let on. And just to be clear, I'm very pro systemic change. We have to have systemic change, like
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
100%.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think most of the time this feels a little, at least when it's coming from non-vegans, it definitely feels like more of an excuse to me
I agree.
than a legitimate concern. But I do try to still deal with that concern. I talk to them as if it's a legitimate concern, because you never know, and I do want to respect, like, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I want to give them the most charitable interpretation possible when I'm talking to them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, you talked about how there's a lot of YouTubers doing the content that you're doing now, and
Mhm.
so I guess a lot of the challenge has been like how to separate yourself out, make your content, um, offer something unique. And I think you've done that by putting the instructions basically and the
Mm-hmm.
explainers in your videos. Like you have text explaining what you're doing. And the one that stands out to me the most that I really liked was when you were talking to somebody and they were struggling to come up with an answer. And you mentioned in this on the screen, this is where I would, like human nature tells you to jump in and rescue them. Don't do that because this is where like the synapses are firing, and
Mm-hmm.
this could be where they're like really connecting. So
Yeah.
it was this really funny like 15 seconds of you just staring at them waiting for them to come up with an answer.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about because sometimes people will like they'll be like, "Ooh," like, and they take a little while to get an answer. But that guy was like on the far end of the statistical distribution. He was like, I think in actuality he took close to a minute to answer that, but I edited it down because it was so
Wow.
long. Yeah, he was just like his wheels were churning. He was like, "Man, I'm trying and I'm just coming up with nothing."
Was
So.
that tough to even stay quiet? Because I mean, as humans, like we're sort of wired to fill the silence. It's
Mhm.
uncomfortable when there's nothing going on.
Yeah, definitely for sure. It's something I definitely have had to practice, and I
Mhm.
still jump in and save people also. But I'm very prepared for that question because I ask that question every time, and I'm like I ask it knowing like okay now just hold back, let them
What
let
was
them
the
take their time.
question? I don't remember.
Yeah. So what I typically do, I have my at least like the first third of any outreach conversation for me is fairly formulaic.
Mhm.
I like to hit some key points so there's like common ground and common understanding. And one of the key points I like to do is to get them to watch some footage because otherwise they're kind of coming from a place of like more like heady, philosophical, intellectual, like, oh, bad things happen to animals. And
Mhm.
I've seen this footage so much. And I think that's one of the reasons why some activists can get really angry at non-vegans when they're like trivializing it or coming up with excuses, because I think sometimes we don't have a shared reality. Like
Yeah.
even if they know what happens and I've seen what happens, the reality for us is still different. There's a difference between like the pure abstraction and then like the concrete witnessing of it. And so not only does that like expose them to something they haven't seen, especially something kind of shocking, but it gives us a shared reality. And I watch it with them. So I'm like they're watching it while they're watching it. And then I step back so what I show them is what happens to pigs. So tails and teeth getting docked. Um, the pigs are getting shocked so that they move through a line, and then it's the pigs in a gas chamber. And we watch that, and then I'm also kind of in a somber space from like
Mhm.
watching that again. And I step back and I say, before you even say anything about the video, I just want to know what you're feeling. And I give them a lot of space then, and so I'm ready to give them space, and I let them kind of talk, and then I pause. I try to pause for like an extra like 3 to 5 seconds after it feels uncomfortable, because that's usually enough time for people to then like they feel uncomfortable and they feel like they need to say something else, and sometimes you'll pull something else out of them.
Mhm.
And then the next question I say is, okay, if you were in the slaughterhouse with them, if you were standing next to the gas chamber, you're about to push them into the gas chamber, and they turn back to you, let's say they can talk, and they say, why are you doing this to me? Like, what is this for? What's the justification you would give them? And that's when I really am going to pause,
Mhm.
because I want to
Mhm.
see like what could they come up with. And a lot of people just simply say like, yeah, I mean, there's no justification. You know what I mean? Some
Yeah.
people answer very quickly. They're like, yeah, that's true. This is completely fucked up. But some people really, they struggle because people play a few moves ahead in a discussion or a debate.
Mhm.
And so people understand if I say, well, there's no justification, then I shouldn't be eating them. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Which means
Yeah.
that I should, at least with pigs, at least I should at least go vegetarian. Um, and so like that's obviously not something they want to do. And so some of them are
Yeah.
not willing to say that there's no justification. Some will still come up with excuses. But I found it's much more likely that they don't come up with excuses when they were just looking at their victim in the eye,
Yeah.
suffocating.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, probably that person that you were talking about who triggered you a little bit.
Hmm.
Like you mentioned, was probably playing a few steps ahead and realized what entailed by her answer, were she to answer honestly.
Exactly.
Um, and do you think she was answering dishonestly?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you watch the whole thing, like the problem back then is that I spoke a little more in like welfarist language at that point.
Mhm.
Um, and so like what I like to do now is I want to highlight the sort of the enslavement, the suffering, and things like that, because I think like they're the most evocative, what I call symptoms of our disease. And the symptoms are important. If you have a disease, the symptoms are what like kick you in the ass to go get
Mhm.
diagnosed to try to do something, right? Like I made this analogy the other day. Like if I have a brain tumor, right, and now I'm getting like horrible headaches. All of a sudden I just start getting horrible headaches. I don't know why. That's what's going to send me to the doctor to get a diagnosis. And they say, "Hey, you have a brain tumor," and I'm like, "Okay,
Mhm.
well, I'm not going to say at that point like, oh, just give me painkillers to reduce the pain, to take away the symptoms." I'm going to say, okay, remove the tumor from my brain, please. And so at this time, I was only talking about symptoms, and I was like, yeah, I told her about the pigs, all the things that happened. She's like, well, those things don't happen at my farm. And I was like, I mean, these happen pretty much everywhere. And she's like, well, there's like a local farm around me, and they don't do that. And that's totally possible. I'm sure there are small farms who don't do these specific things. And she's like, just like, oh, like they're treated super well and all this stuff. And
Mhm.
I didn't have really the wherewithal at that time to be like, okay, well, those are just the symptoms. The deeper issue is this idea that we're viewing animals as resources, that we're seeing them as something rather than someone. And so even if I grant that this farm is doing that, this is doing nothing to dismantle this idea from your mind that they're resources for us to use when they're not. And so I didn't have that. So all I had was her claiming that that she has this
Mhm.
magical farm somewhere. And even then it was like, because I think I even asked her, I was like, so like, you don't go out to restaurants or like, on vacation? Like, what do you do? I can't remember exactly what I said to her, but it was like, she was just like, nope, nope, nope. This is the only time I eat pigs is this. And like, and she was also getting like pretty incensed. And I'm just like, okay, there's the chance of this being true is so low to begin with, like just the facts of the matter, let
Mhm.
alone her values. And so yeah, I think that's exactly what was happening. She was just kind of playing several moves ahead. She knew if she admitted that that it's not okay, that might doesn't make right, then she would have to
Mhm.
admit that all this sort of use, abuse, and exploitation was bad. But yeah, I didn't have that in my arsenal yet, of sort of rhetoric. And
Yeah.
so and even then, even at that point, I went home and I like researched, and I actually looked at all these like local farms, and it turns out that all local, like even super small local farms, even homesteads, I found all these like DIY videos of like castrating pigs. And there's
Mhm.
even a farmer. It's the farmers' videos. This isn't vegan activist videos. It's the farmers' videos themselves. And in one of them, one of the farmers is like, "There's no other way to do this. If you have pigs, you have to do this. Like I don't care what your farm is." And it's like man. And I found that I was like, oh, if I just would have had that in the moment, which would have been good, of course. But it still, I
Mhm.
don't think would have highlighted, it still would have been talking about symptoms, and it wouldn't have been highlighting the disease that is viewing them as objects.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah, and when you're on symptoms, you can just go from one symptom to the next, and then it
yeah,
becomes this Rolodex that they're rolling on you.
yes,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, and that would be frustrating. Well, I did this with Natalie Fulton, who's
mm-hmm,
I know is a friend of yours. I had her. We did like a little role play where
mm-hmm.
I was this drunk guy on the streets of New Orleans, and she was doing her outreach.
Yeah,
But do you want to do that? Do you want to roll through one? And I'll try to.
sure,
I'm going to try to stump you, but not be completely unreasonable. So,
okay.
yeah, how would you typically start? Just say I'm some guy walking along the street.
Yeah, let's see. Let's do an easy one. I won't do one of my
Yeah.
like more convoluted ones. So really common one, like a lot of people use this. I'll say like, hey, like usually it's someone when someone comes up. So I'll be like, hey, thanks for coming over. I just want to
Do you
let you
have like
know.
a, sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt, do you have like a sign or something that kind of
yeah.
brings them over?
Yeah, so it says help me grow my YouTube channel, answer thought-provoking questions. So
Interesting.
what I'd start with is, and these are important. These aren't always in the video, but they are important parts. So I'd be like, hey, what's up? What's your name? I don't know if how far you want to role play, but then like I said, I'd be like,
Hmm.
so like, do you live in New Orleans? You just visiting? Like, what's going on? You know? And then
Yeah.
I'd be like, what are you passionate about? Like what do you like to do? What's something you're passionate about? And then you would tell me, and so we'd be building up a rapport right from there, and trust.
Okay.
And then once we chat a little bit, I'd say, okay, got my video ready and stuff. I just want to let you know, just do you see that there's a camera there? You do? Okay, you're cool. This is going to be
Hmm.
filmed. Awesome. One other thing I want to tell you, if at any point in this conversation you feel uncomfortable, you feel like you need to leave, you just don't like the conversation, you can totally walk away. Obviously, I'm not holding you here. I'm not going to physically restrain you, but also just on an emotional level. I'm not going to be like, wow, what a jerk. So at any time, if you want to leave, you're not going to offend me. It's totally fine with me. And so I say all that, and that builds up a lot of trust. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And I think that's a big part of why many of my conversations, the people don't get super defensive, because I've already made them feel very safe in what the interaction is
Yeah.
going to be.
Hmm.
So that would all be preamble before I even ask a question.
Yeah.
And so then, yeah, we can get into the questions if you want.
Yeah, and so now the camera's rolling, and
Sure.
and I trust you. You seem like
Yeah.
this nice guy, and I want to help your YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
see where we go from there.
Sure. So yeah, the first question is going to seem a little silly, but what do you think about animal abuse and people who abuse animals?
Okay. Yeah, I think animal abuse is terrible, and anybody that abuses animals is, um, well, I mean, why would you even abuse an animal? It just seems really horrible and cruel.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. I guess like what when you think of abuse, like give me like what is abuse to you? Like can you define it or give me examples?
Yeah, maybe. So, an example I would give is like maybe like just arbitrarily hurting someone, like someone's like walking like their dog, and maybe you kick that dog. That's just
Yeah.
like cruel animal abuse. Or like some people just like they'll leave their dogs in a hot car or something.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
Yeah. So like maybe if there's some sort of physical pain or emotional pain, like I
Yeah.
assume like if I kicked a rock, you wouldn't call that abuse. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, fair to say.
Okay. So, but if I kicked a dog, and so like it seems to be something like the experience of the dog is kind of what adds to that abuse.
Right, right. I agree.
Okay. So, sort of the experience, maybe the dog can feel pain, maybe they can feel emotions. And generally, we are saying like abuse is bad, right?
Yeah. And I
Okay.
want to pause right here,
Yeah.
just like, because the way that you set this up, you've already got the person sort of pre-admitting that animals feel that they feel
Yes.
pain, all this, because sometimes people do deny this. But if
Yes.
you I like how you start by asking them about animal abuse, because they have to sort of articulate it themselves. All right,
Exactly.
unpause.
Yeah,
Yeah,
is that so?
go
Yeah,
ahead.
so the point is, yeah, I'll just speak meta for one more minute. The point is
Yeah.
to actually understand their values and to get them to express their values. I don't want to tell them what their values are. I want to actually know that they know that animals can feel pain before we like move on.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay, unpause.
so third question, and just want to tell you, no judgment here, but this question might seem a little harder. But do
Mhm.
you think that there's any industries that you pay for that sort of systematically abuse animals?
No, I don't think so. I'm really against animal abuse.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people are kind of unsure about this.
Mhm.
But let me just ask you: do you eat like chickens or pigs or cow's milk, or maybe chicken
Hmm.
eggs? Do you eat any of
Yeah.
those things?
Yeah,
Any
I
animals?
do. I do eat those.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about pigs then. Do you know anything about like what happens to pigs?
Um, to be honest, no, I don't really know what happens to pigs.
Yeah. No, a lot of people don't. That's totally fine. Can I actually just show you a quick 1 minute video of what happens in the pig industry?
Sure.
Okay. Then I show you the
Yeah.
video.
So
It's
then,
like
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
all the the horrible stuff that I just said. And
yeah. It's this horrible gas
yeah.
chambers, and yeah.
Yeah, and I typically
Okay.
explain why along the way. I'll be like, the reason they're doing that is X. The reason they're chopping
Okay.
the tails and teeth is because we cram them together. They get very distressed.
Okay, so
So
so they're watching like a 1 minute video, and you're doing a voiceover throughout a little bit.
yes. So it
Okay.
depends kind of on how much I'm reading their body language a bit because I
Hmm.
don't want them to walk away from the video. So if they're
Yeah.
really engaged and just like, damn, I'll just, I'll try not to say as much. But if they're kind of like swaying or moving, I'll talk a little bit to like kind of bring them
Keep
in.
them there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, if they, like, some people have been like, hey, they're midway through, they're like, I can't watch this. I'm like, that's totally fine. I'm not going to make you watch this if this is like too much.
Yeah.
So I'll stop it. So then the video ends, and I say, okay, so before we even talk about that video, because I know there's a lot there. Is there anything that you're like feeling right now? Like, are you feeling like happy or sad or disgusted or like elated? Like, are there any emotions that you're feeling after watching that?
Yeah, I think I feel bad. I think that's terrible. I don't understand why they do that to those pigs.
Yeah,
I don't understand it.
yeah,
I mean,
it is
surely there's
crazy.
a better way to do it than that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot of people think that, you know. But yeah, I felt horrible the first time I watched it. I feel horrible still every time I see it. So that's totally valid. Like it's a very very human emotion to feel there.
Hmm.
I guess something I'm thinking of is, you know, seeing that pig, and you kind of said like, I think earlier in our conversation you said kicking someone, and then you're referring to a dog as someone. You know, it's bad because they can feel pain, and like why would someone do that? So I think it's a good question to ask, why would someone do that? So like if you were in the slaughterhouse with the pig, right, and you were about to put them in that gas chamber, and they, let's say they could talk or something silly like that, and they look at
Hmm.
you and they say, why are you doing this to me? Like, why are you going to put me in this gas chamber? What sort of like good justification do you think you could give them in that moment?
I would, yeah, I would probably tell them I'm sorry.
Mm,
Maybe, that people have to eat. Um, yeah, so this is kind of funny because when I said this someone, I'm me again.
yeah,
When
yeah.
I said someone, I was like, I caught myself. I was like, that's
Oh, that's
actually
funny.
me
Okay.
coming through. And
Okay.
and yeah, it's hard for me to do this because
Yeah.
like the role play is like I'm trying to be reasonable like when I'm
Mm,
doing this, so that it's not like just a cartoon character.
yeah.
Uh, but it just everything logically just follows towards veganism. So, I mean,
Yeah.
and maybe that's how your street outreach typically tends to go. I mean, do you
Mhm.
say you have a high success rate at least in getting the person to a point that you feel like, yeah, I've definitely like at least checked some boxes for this person.
Oh yeah. Almost every street outreach I do, I'm like, that person is definitely further along the vegan, like you know, some people say the 100 point
Hmm.
scale. And so everything you just saw was like, that was all the sort of pre-made. I always want to hit all that at the beginning, and
Hmm.
like you said, like even like you're trying to be in the mindset of being someone who's kind of belligerent, and the questions are designed to really diffuse that. So it's like because
Yeah.
it's really hard to be belligerent with those questions, right? Because there's no like,
Yeah.
there's I try not to make it feel like the person is being attacked at every point along the way. You know what I mean? And I'm
Hmm.
just there to explore something with them. You know,
Hmm.
like nowhere yet have I like accused the person of something. I haven't said like, that's really bad what you did, or like, how could you possibly do this? You know, I'm saying like, what would you say to them? And I'm also like reflecting the values that you know already had. And like, I latched on as soon as I heard a couple words in the beginning. I was like, remember those? And I
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that. You
Yeah.
know, like I
Yeah.
try to
Uh-huh.
remember like, what did they say, and then I'll bring it back and I'll say, I remember you said this. You know,
Yeah.
and that also makes it a little harder for them to argue, because usually they're not like, well, I didn't really mean that. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
So yeah, this is usually the point at which, if someone wants to become more like belligerent or combative, they do. Because like you kind of said, you're like, well, you know, we have to eat. And so then I would just keep doing questions, you know. And like, I think what a lot of activists are going to be tempted to do is like, well, we don't need to eat animals, we can eat plants and be healthy, right? That's what they're going to want to say. But what I'm going to want to say is, do we have to eat pigs? You know. And again, it
Hmm.
just puts it back on them, and it's like, it's not it's not me telling anything. It's not me imposing anything. It's just like, well, do we though? You know, and
Yeah.
then when
Yeah.
they're like, well, yeah, I think we do, like, because X, Y, Z, I'll be like, well, why do you think that? Like, what do you think it is about pigs that means that we have to eat them to be healthy? You know, and
Hmm.
then they'll say, well, I like protein. I'm like, okay, do plants have protein? You know, and like, at some point, I will just sort of answer I will actually just give them answers, but I like to get them as far along as I possibly can and see what they already know. Because sometimes they'll say, yeah, because we need to eat it. We need to eat them. And I'll be like, do we need to eat them? And they'll be like, well, I guess not. You know what I mean? Because sometimes
Yeah.
the excuses just come out as a rapid fire reaction. And so if they go, we need to eat them, I go, no, we don't. They go, well, I think actually we do. You know what I mean? That causes this escalation. But if they say, well, we need to eat them, I'm like, do we? Then oftentimes they'll be like, no, I guess not. You know? And so like everything along the way is meant to not get them into that defensive state where we start spiraling out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I started my activism, it was watching like Earthling Ed and Anonymous for the Voiceless videos and them using the Socratic method. Um, so obviously you're employing the Socratic method. I'm wondering how much, what informs your activism beyond that? Because you mentioned before we started recording that you didn't really intend to do this. You were going to talk about philosophy with your YouTube channel, and other things. So, are there lessons from academia that you've picked up that informs your activism?
Yes. So
Yeah.
there's a couple of books I've read that come from like a lot of scientific studies related to like psychology, teaching, those sorts of things. So like two books I always recommend: Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy by Casey Taft. Super good book, very short, very actionable. He's a psychiatrist. He works with domestic abusers.
Okay.
And so he's trying to get domestic abusers to like admit that they are domestic abusers and to stop doing it.
Wow.
And so, and what he says in there is he's like, the parallels between what domestic abusers say and what non-vegans say is like, you know, I mean, he doesn't say it's an overlapping Venn diagram, but he makes the point that it's very similar. And so what he says is, while we don't have a lot of research on like what convinces people to go vegan, like we don't have a lot of peer-reviewed research. We have like research that like animal rights organizations have done, but of course, like they're not always peer-reviewed. They're not always like subject to the same statistical analysis as like, you know, what something in a journal would be. But his methods actually are, because they're in psychiatry, right? They've been published in psychiatry journals and things like that. And I think he himself has made like one of the gold standard methods for talking with domestic abusers. And so that is a really good book to get those general principles. It's not like vegan arguments. Like, what do you say if they say veganism is expensive? You know, it's not that kind of book. It's like more of this, like the how do you talk to them?
Yeah.
And so he brings up a lot of good stuff in there. One of the things he says is like in that research, the top predictor of if the person changes is how much they like the therapist, like how good their relationship is with the therapist. And so that's another thing I'm trying to do in my outreach. I'm trying to like have a good relationship with the person, which is why I'm trying to like, I'm not trying to like really like dunk on them or score points. And I'm doing all these like consent things, like, you know, I just want to let you know you can leave at any time. You know, there's a camera there. You know that, right? Ha ha ha. So I'm trying to build that sense of safety for them, so that they feel safe in changing their mind. And that's something from this other book. It's called How Minds Change. And something they say in there is that like, it's so silly. If you want to really change someone's mind, it's so silly to frame it as a competition or a debate, because the winner of the debate is the person who doesn't change their mind. So if you frame your conversation as a debate, you're basically asking the person to not change their mind. That's the way they win, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas if you frame it as a conversation, a collaboration, instead of a debate frame, you're in a learning frame, right? And so now I'm talking to them and I'm like trying to teach them something, like, not in a condescending way, you know what I mean? But I'm trying to have them almost teach themselves. And so I'm more like a guide along their sort of like ethical and intellectual journey. I'm like giving them information and then being like, so how does that affect you? How does this affect your beliefs? And so that's the more like broad scale picture that I'm coming at the conversation from. Like, I want to have a good relationship with them. I want them to feel safe, and I want them to feel like it's a learning conversation, not a like I dunked on you debate.
I think that sign that you have is brilliant because
Mm-hmm.
you're actually asking them for help. So it kind of
Mm-hmm.
puts them in a like, oh, like, yeah, let me do some charity for this guy here
Yes.
for a
Yeah.
second. They can feel good about that. Also, the way you speak is a very has a very gentle tone to it and kind of
Mm.
like an inviting introspection kind of tone. And I know
Mm.
you said you have a background in teaching.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
think
Yeah.
it shows. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it shows.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about that or if you're able to talk about that, but like, what sort of teaching do you do?
Well, I used to teach. So
Okay.
in college, I did tutoring. I think my sophomore year, I had like pretty good grades and everything. I mean, I got really good grades in college. And so
Mhm.
like the professors were just like, "Hey, can you tutor this class?" you know. I think
Mm.
I was even tutoring one of the classes while I was in it, if I remember correctly. So I was like,
Interesting.
the teacher was basically like, "I know you're going to crush this next test, so just like tutor the people while you're
Mhm.
like teaching it or whatever, or while you're studying it yourself." And then so I tutored like multiple subjects. I think I tutored like genetics, biology, maybe chemistry. Um, I wasn't as good at math, so I never got to tutor that, but I did tutor a bunch of other subjects. And there was a lot of interesting, like, so they train you and they give you like the broad strokes of teaching. And so like I learned a lot from that. Um, One of the things being that you know, people tend to have really bad what's called metacognition.
Mhm.
Particularly people who don't get good grades have bad metacognition. And metacognition is basically knowing what you know. So it's like, how well do you understand your own intellectual capabilities or your own
Mhm.
knowledge base? And people who are bad at that, unsurprisingly, do bad on tests because they think they know more than they do. So they're like, I know everything. I'm going to get an A on this test, and they go in and get a D. And in fact, there was a guy in my classes who was exactly like that. He would come in and he'd be like, "Oh yeah, I only studied 2 hours last night. Why'd you study so long, bro?" "Yeah, dude, I know everything. Like I'm gonna kill this." And I'm like, "All right," And then he'd get like a C minus or a D or like something just like
Mhm.
bomb the test. And it's like, dude, you have no idea what you know. And so I think of that. This is also like I'm sure many people have heard of like the Dunning Kruger effect and things like that. And it's just
I have
it,
not.
oh
Yeah,
the
let me know.
oh
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
What's
So
up?
I may not get this all exactly correct because there has been like some controversy around it, but the general principle is that people who are really confident actually tend to know the least.
Mm.
And in fact, oftentimes experts in fields are quite humble about their knowledge. They're like, "There's so much I don't know." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's a mismatch, an almost inversion between the confidence in your position and how much you actually know. It's called the Dunning Kruger effect. That's a little bit of a cartoonish description
Hmm.
of it, but that's basically what it is. But what all that does is that puts you in a mind of understanding that just because someone says they know something or just because it seems like they know something, that doesn't mean they do. And so, I often ask people, I'll say, like, what do you know about like what happens to pigs? And they're like, "Oh, I've seen it. I've seen it. It's
Mm.
bad." And I'm like, "Okay, but like what?" They're like, "Yeah, I know it's really bad." I'm like, "But just get specific for me." And then they'll be like, "Well, they're kept in cages, they're fed hormones, they're force fed." The people always say those three things, because
Yeah.
whatever the popular documentaries have been, that's all they've shown. And so then as I'm saying, I'll be like, "Oh yeah, that's definitely some of it. I know a lot of people know about that, but there's actually a lot more." Can I show you a quick 1 minute video of like what happens in the pig industry? And so like that puts me in a space to not trust people and to
Hmm.
know that there's always further depths they can explore. And so that when I'm asking them those questions, sometimes it can feel kind of silly. Even with like the do you like what do you think of animal abuse? It's like, man, that's so silly. Everyone thinks this is shitty. But I know as I ask them additional questions, we're gonna find out things about them that maybe they didn't know on the surface. You know what I mean? And maybe I didn't know, and maybe I didn't know about them. Because people will say animal abuse is wrong for sort of different reasons. And even that little flavor of how they answer can kind of give you something to latch on to or to like direct the conversation later. Because some people will
Hmm.
say it's like bad because like the person is bad. Like that's a messed up person that would do that. And some people will focus more on the animal. And I know if someone's focusing on the person, then it's like I got to do a little more work. I got to get them to the point that like this is inherently bad for the victim. Whereas if they're already identifying with the victim, it's a little less. I don't have to be quite as guarded with my wording and my rhetoric. And so just that idea that people don't always know what they know, and sometimes also there's this idea of I can't remember what the words are, but it's like explicit knowledge versus like implicit knowledge. And so like people, you know, if you ask them, if people aren't specifically thinking about something, it's like they kind of don't know it until you ask them. So like the cow question, like, you know, why does a mother, or why does it, you don't say mother cow, why does a cow
Yeah,
produce
yeah.
milk?
Right.
Many people probably in their head are just walking around thinking that cows produce milk all the time. If I
Hmm.
ask you, why does the cow produce milk? A lot of people still won't know, but a lot of people will pause and go, oh, it's for their baby. Like, they'll be able to put it together in the moment. And so, like,
Hmm.
did they know that or did they not know that? It's kind of a weird, like, their implicit knowledge, it wasn't there until it was probed. But then when you
Yeah.
ask it, they can explicitly, you know, say it. And so that's another thing I'm thinking about. Like, even if these people, like, even if when I ask them, they'll explicitly know it, that doesn't mean that they implicitly are aware of it. It's not like something that is like live in their brain at all times. And so sometimes these like stupid or silly questions, asking them can still be quite valuable because it still puts it in the forefront of their mind, and it connects as maybe like you said, those synapses that maybe have been a little rusty. You know what I mean? We like
Hmm. Hmm.
reinvigorate them. It's like, oh yeah, that's the issue. And I think the same thing goes for values and moral questions. You know, our values around animals and the morals have sort of atrophied because
Hmm.
society has made them atrophy. And
Yeah.
so like just probing those very obvious questions, like, well, what do you think about animal abuse, right? It's like, well, yeah, everyone thinks this is silly, but that doesn't mean like their brain is working on that problem all the time. And so we want to bring that problem to the forefront of their mind.
Yeah. I mean, even trying to role play it was interesting, just thinking like, how would somebody answer this when they're, like, how would me 6 years ago answer that question,
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that example that you brought up about mother cows is a great
Mhm.
example because that seems to be like a collective ignorance we have. I didn't really
Yeah.
understand why cows produce milk.
Me
And
either.
I had, so, some of the most intelligent people I know, I was posting something about that on my social media, wrote me a message like, I'm embarrassed how long it took me to learn that.
Yes.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a very strange thing that we just didn't understand. Um,
Yeah, it's wild. I
it
know it's the
is
same thing with
wild.
me. Very smart people didn't know it, and then as soon as you hear it, you're like, "Oh shit!" Like, because it's so obvious after you hear it. It's like one of those, yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. Although I guess conceivably you could think, which I probably did before all
mhm.
this, like that cows produce milk for their baby, but they don't necessarily not produce it all the time. You know
Right, I
what I
see.
mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like
Yeah.
there's a, yeah.
But that wouldn't make a lot of sense, I guess. Unless you
That's
were
funny.
put on this earth to provide milk for humans,
Yes,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Um, so
Which is sort of what people think.
Yeah, people do believe that. So it sounds like you were sort of getting ahead in your classes, and like your professors were noticing that you were a bit ahead of the curve in at least some of your classes to
Hmm.
go ahead and teach people. Why is that? Why were you getting ahead? Were you in really studious, or are you kind of naturally? I don't mean to make you
Hmm.
compliment yourself. Are you sort of naturally intelligent?
Hmm. Yeah. So I did study really hard.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And so there is that component of it. Part of it, though, so maybe I can. This is an example that maybe will shed some light. I don't know exactly what this says, but like,
Mhm.
so I did study a lot. Um, and I was oftentimes at like the top of my classes. So like if I had a biology class and there were 400 people, you know, I was like in the top 5 grades typically. So I
Mhm.
was like scoring at the top of the class, which is like fine. But there was one class, it was a genetics class, and we had this professor, and people kind of didn't like him because he was a little bit of a smartass, but most people thought his tests were pretty hard. And the reason is that his tests were not so much, they weren't just problems, like sort of like science math problems, and they also weren't just purely memorization. Like, you know, what is the what is the molecule that's like DNA but it uses like ribonucleic acid or whatever. They weren't just questions like that. He would do like things like, hey, you just found an alien species on another planet. This is what their cell wall looks like, and there's a sequence in there, and then he would just make up things like, you know, rather than, you know, whatever the components that you typically find in a cell, like the typical amino acids. He'd be like, here's a made up amino acid, and here's another made up amino acid, and there's an organelle that looks like this and does this. And he's like, you know, how would you go, like, how do you think the cell is going to divide? If the cell divides 5 times, like, da 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 da. And so what he was trying to get us to do was to take the principles of biology and understand them at a deeper level, and then apply them to new problems. So not just memorization, not just like a fancy math problem, but like, how do I actually take the things I already know, the principle at the principle level, and then apply that principle elsewhere. And so people hated him. They did like we had one test, and I think the average on the test was like a 50% or something. So the average was that everyone failed. And on that test, I actually got like a 96 or something. And I think I was the only person like that got above like a 60. And so like he didn't even include me in the curve. He was like, I'm just like taking you out of this test entirely, and then I'll grade on the curve for these other people. And I later went and worked in his lab, because he was like, yeah, I want you to come and like work in my lab with me whenever you get to like junior or senior or whatever. But that was an interesting thing to realize. Like that particular class, like most people really sucked at, and I was like kind of doing similar to how I did in other classes. And so I think there was something there about when I study things. I think a lot of people try to just memorize them, whereas like I really want to understand the underlying principle behind what is happening. And so I think I studied a different way than most people. I think the way I remember things is by remembering principles and then like generalizing from them, rather than just like brute force memorizing a bunch of facts. And that kind of plays in my outreach, because like, you know, sometimes people will say things like, well, you know, it's part of culture and blah, blah, blah. And rather than being like, you know, well, slavery was part of culture, so da 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 da. Like I kind of ask, I go, okay, so like, if something is part of culture, are we saying that because it's part of culture, then it can't be bad? Or like, have there been counterexamples in history? And so when I ask that, I'm thinking in that principle mindset. What is the principle they're expressing? And does that principle like actually hold? My dog is barking.
You're so you're my third interview, and every one of them has had animals in the background. So
Okay.
it's only appropriate.
He's stuck in my room, so he's gonna keep barking. So I got to get him out of my room real quick. I'll be back.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. Well, I'm gonna elucidate for the camera while you're gone. It just sounds like Justin thinks about things in an analytical way, which so I probably do this less. So when I'm watching like an outreach video from someone like Earthling Ed, I'm looking more for the results than necessarily the how was this done kind of aspect that someone like Justin is looking at. And it makes me wonder, and what I'm going to ask him when he comes back is, like one thing is there something in our past, someone like Justin, that makes him more open to that line of thinking? So I was just talking to the audience about what I might ask you just from that line of. It sounds like you think about things in sort of a more analytical way. And I kind of want to get to like where that came from. And I also want to ask you if you grew up like getting like used to being challenged, and whether or not, like, I also am curious, did you grow up in a family where like grades were expected to be really good?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so my mom like definitely wanted, or at least what happened is, I'm not sure if I guess this is a chicken and the egg scenario, but I was like pretty well behaved and studious when I was really young. And so like teachers liked me, and I got good grades like very early on. And at some point, I think when I was in third grade, like the teacher recommended me for like the gifted program or whatever. And what ended up happening, I think, was that my mom was like, oh, my kid's special, you know? And then so she just started expecting.
Set the bar too high. Yeah.
Right. And then I kind of got in that mindset myself of being very obsessive and, you know, trying to get good grades. And I think it kind of like, it was a bit of a spiral with like me and my mom's expectations. And that just sort of carried into college with me. So, yeah.
So was there a point? Was there a point, like maybe with your mother, where you might have an answer for something, And you know how like in a math class, they'll be like, here's your answer, but you got to show your work, you know, show us how you arrived at that answer. Was she or others in your life kind of expecting you to explain like how you've arrived at certain conclusions more so than, which kind of maybe set you on the path to thinking about more analytically how this is happening?
No. I was
No.
expecting them to do that, and they wouldn't do it
Oh,
or couldn't do it. Yeah, like even from when I was a
interesting.
pretty young, actually, like I was like challenging my parents on stuff like that. So my parents both
Mhm.
are chronic smokers and alcoholics, like
Oh,
drink
wow.
every day alcoholics. And
Okay.
since I was a little kid, I've always actually kind of been like into health. Although that has almost nothing to do with my veganism. Like it was
Mhm.
almost like yeah, it didn't really affect, or it didn't like propel me to go vegan at all.
Mhm.
But yeah, like so from a very young age, I was constantly asking them. I was like, okay, well, why are you smoking and drinking? Like, you know, this is terrible for you.
Mhm.
Let me actually close this blind real quick.
Yeah, no
So
worries.
sorry, otherwise I'm gonna have weird like banding on my face and eyes the whole time.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so no, it wasn't it wasn't them asking me for justifications. It was me asking them for justifications.
Okay.
Yeah, like it's actually one of the things that sticks out in my mind is that, and they could never give me a good answer for that, and I didn't like really understand addiction as a kid, and they couldn't explain it to me.
Mhm.
So I was just like, just stop doing it, you know. And so even I don't know, I was probably like 6 to 7 when I started like questioning them on that. And one thing I remember that ironically sticks out in my mind is whenever Michael Vick was doing dogfighting,
Mhm.
and my parents were absolutely like incensed about this. Like, I can't believe this. This is ridiculous. And I was like, well, it's kind of weird, right? Because like, aren't we like just eating animals? Like like I don't even know if dogs die in dogfighting. Like maybe they do. Sometimes I genuinely don't know. I don't know that much about dogfighting, but I know the animals are definitely dying when we're eating them. And
Yeah.
dude, they were so upset about that. And I wasn't even coming from a vegan perspective. I was clearly coming from, like just purely an analytical perspective. Like this is a consistency test, and something isn't adding up. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And they were like, they were not having it. Like they were so angry. Like just acting like typical like defensive non-vegans when presented with something like this. And you know, I pushed back to some degree, but it wasn't something I cared about a lot. I just like noted it as like a really weird inconsistency, and it was weird to me, particularly how mad they got, because I would point
Mhm.
out inconsistencies to them in other instances, and they kind of argue, be like grumble, grumble, whatever. But this one
Mhm.
really like really struck a nerve with them, and so like I've always sort of remembered it. And then when I went vegan, I found it really funny that that's like one of the memories I have of this. You know, you were asking if I grew up getting challenged a lot, and the answer to that is yes. My mom, being an alcoholic, would specifically like really start like arguments with me out of nowhere, and
Mhm.
they typically like I think it was even like Sunday nights was like the typical night that they would happen, like to the extent that my dad actually like it was like almost like a joke, like, oh, here we go, it's Sunday night, like I know these two are going to get in a huge argument, right? And so she would be drinking and
Mhm.
arguing with me, and it was the classic belligerent drunk. It's like not like everything you say. It's a goalpost shift. It's a move somewhere else. It's a redirect. It's a red herring. It's a like totally switching the subject, you know, or just like saying like debunking an excuse, and then 5 seconds later that same excuse comes back, you know.
Mhm.
And so it was kind of like arguing with like the absolute worst, you know, most defensive carnist there is.
Mhm.
And so that I definitely, you know, I was I would say it was like forged there in the arguments with my mom, and that probably started around like late middle school. So that was
Wow.
probably like, you know, I don't know, 5 6 years potentially of like very consistent arguments all the time with my mom.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I liked arguing anyway. I was arguing with kids at school all the time about random shit just because I enjoy like arguing and debating stuff. But that was like a really like a supercharging of it. I think that's
That
actually maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
that Michael Vick conversation that you guys had when you were young. I'm interested. What do they think now? Now that you're doing this, I guess you know pretty much for a living.
Yeah, so not totally for a living yet. I
Not
can't
to
make quite enough money on this as it is.
on your way though.
I hope I'm getting there. I hope I'm getting there.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they're as intransigent and stubborn as ever. Now my
Mm.
mom is like totally like when I go to their house, she makes fully vegan everything. So you know she makes a whole vegan meal for us,
Hmm.
and she's a good cook too. So she actually
Hmm.
makes good vegan food.
Hmm.
uh, but you know her and my dad aren't vegan, and like they definitely. I'm at a point where I don't really attempt to argue with them anymore. Like I've sort of outgrown that because I know the outcome of it. And so it's funny because I actually didn't argue with them. Like I wasn't trying to start arguments. I was just like, yeah, I'm vegan. Like
Hmm.
I'm not gonna eat like animals or their secretions when I come there. So I just need some sort of like vegan friendly options. But like didn't even like wasn't like, hey guys, have you ever thought about XYZ? Like da 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 da. Like I was like, nope, just gonna leave it. We'll just have normal family whatever chit chat. But they can't leave well enough alone, and so like they're the ones who brought it up, and I'm like, okay, well here we go, like strap
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
you know. But even then, like I feel like my heart wasn't really in it because I just like I've been burned by them so much before. Like you know how people get burned out. Like oh, I tried to talk to my family several times about veganism, and I just can't get them to go.
Hmm.
Well, I
Hmm.
tried to talk to my parents about everything for the past like 20 years, and I could never convince them really of anything. And so like this like I didn't even really like put a super like good faith effort into it. I debunked all like my dad's arguments, but like I didn't push it beyond that. Like,
Hmm.
you know, they were putting out the arguments, I was just debunking them. I did send my mom something on wool because she was like, "What's wrong with wool?" And I sent her like this gruesome wool video.
Oh
um,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, which
What
she was upset
did
about.
she watch it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She was
So
like, she was like, "Don't send me stuff like that." She's like, "That's the worst of the worst." She's like, "That's not how it's normally done." I'm like, "All right."
did you ever consider sending them Earthlings or Dominion and see if they would watch it?
They definitely wouldn't. I don't think
Uh,
my mom even watched the whole wool thing. Uh,
uh.
but I could definitely, yeah. I mean, they would watch some of it and then just like cope so hard afterwards. Uh, yeah.
Well, I hear from a lot of people that they struggle with their parents, their family, brothers, sisters. So,
Hmm.
and with you, it's almost like a unique case in that, with your situation with your family. But yeah, I think that I would sometimes I wonder why that is because they're the people that are closest to us, and a lot of people that say that are the people who are like the best at doing the outreach. They can
Hmm.
convince anybody on the street. But I think, and I'll just answer my own question from my perspective. I think it's probably because we feel like we have a lot to lose with them,
Hmm.
or that we're trying to. There's another consideration, which is our relationship with them,
Hmm. Yeah.
which we don't have to think about with a person on the street that we may never see again
Yeah.
or likely won't.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. There's definitely different stakes for sure. But I think I've just like, as I've gotten older, I have like it's like almost like a split of
Hmm.
friends. And like some of my friends just have parents who they've just had toxic relationships with their whole life.
Yeah.
And then other of my friends have actually had pretty good relationships.
Hmm.
And it's wild to me, like because so many of my friends do have these toxic relationships that like I just kind of thought it was normal. And we're all talking like, oh yeah, my parents do this, my parents like typical parents, right? And then we have a
Hmm.
couple friends in our friends group who are like, oh, what are you talking about? My parents do that, and like, yeah, they like encouraged me, and like if I like had a disagreement, this is how they handled it, and we're just like, what the fuck? like,
Yeah.
I'm like gross. That sounds disgusting. like how healthy and like supportive and stuff they were, and so like I think some of our most toxic relationships are actually with our parents, and so I think some people have that and some don't. And when you don't have it, I think it's definitely for some people. I think they can just totally relate. Like, yeah, I'm never gonna convince my parents.
Hmm.
They're like, yeah, I know, because yeah, communicating with them is the worst. And other people who don't have those toxic relationships are like, well, like these people are really close to me. They've helped me in my whole life. Like why wouldn't they be open? And I'm so jealous because there's a lot of people I've talked to who have been able to convince their parents, or like they told their parents they had one conversation with them, and their parents are like, oh wow, I guess I got to go vegan, And I'm like, oh,
Hmm.
that's the difference between like a toxic a toxic relationship with your family and like a healthy relationship with your family.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, and you were fighting with your mother basically every Sunday, and you kind of matter of factly said that. Do you think, not to turn this into therapy for Justin, but do you think that that was like a trauma for you? Like, did it hurt you growing up?
Yeah, so probably I think if you'd asked me this last year, I probably would have said no.
Mm-hmm.
Because my definition of trauma was much narrower. I'd probably be thinking of it more in like PTSD sort of trauma. But taking like a sort of broader definition of trauma, meaning more like a sort of like wound that you have that affects how you act now.
Mm-hmm.
And it can potentially cause you to go into some like potentially pathological behavior patterns because of it. I would say yes, probably. I think my some of my obsessiveness is natural, but I think also it probably was supercharged by those interactions. So getting really obsessive about being right about something, you know.
Mm.
And the funny thing is I try like not to bring that to my vegan outreach conversations, but I do bring it to my like vegan video essays. So like I don't know if you've seen like I did a 3-part series on crop deaths, and that video ended up those 3 videos together ended up being like over an hour long. And initially I was planning on that being like a 15-minute video, but
Mm-hmm.
as I got into it, I was making it. I was like, well, what if someone says this, and then what if they say this, and then what if they say this? Well, I'll get ahead of every single objection possible.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And in the videos, I'm like, yeah, and if this is what you mean by X, then ABC. But also consider this angle and this angle and this angle and this angle, and you might say this, but da da da. Like I gotta retort to that as well, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so like this like idea of like obsessively like needing to have an answer for everything to make this totally bulletproof is definitely informed by my relationship with my mom. And in fact, you know what I've told people recently is that like the past year when I was doing those video essays, those drained me and like fucked me up mentally way more than having conversations with people. Partially because I was just sitting in a room alone, staring at a computer for a long period of time, but I do think it was probably a reopening of that wound in a way, of that sort of like parental relationship without it being super explicit in my mind. And so when
Mm.
I do that, like the thing is, like it's kind of one of these things that I think it makes the video good in a way because it makes it detailed in a way that I think many people aren't willing to go that deep into detail
Mm-hmm.
because they're psychologically healthy, because they're not having this like obsessive drive to like, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of a double-edged sword. And I noticed that it really, really wore me down. And so, yeah, I mean, that would be an instance of it, I guess, being a double-edged sword or of it informing my activism or my YouTube channel in a way that wasn't wholly healthy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that. Like, it kind of helped that video. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that many people who have gone towards animal rights and compassion for animals do so because they have a decently high level of empathy, and that may come because they've felt some pain in their past or something.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that they're able to relate in some way. So in a way, yeah, we use our pains or our traumas in ways that are beneficial. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's obviously the hope. I mean, when I went vegan, I had just lost my job and my girlfriend like within days of each other. And so I
Oh,
was just
interesting.
in this, yeah, I was in this like real period of personal turmoil, and luckily was able to use some of that to my advantage and to help others. But yeah, I mean, obviously it doesn't always happen that way, but that's really interesting. Yeah. And yeah, I bet you that was probably one of the better explanations of the crop deaths, because you know not only just having an answer for everything, but just having the confidence that you're correct about
Mm.
everything. Um, like, because like not all of our positions are as thought through. Like, I feel like I feel like some people come to animal rights through a logical
Mm-hmm.
like entry point. But for me, it was just seeing what happens to animals. And I know that's how it is for a lot of people. So we see that this is terrible, but we start out without like all the facts that
Mm-hmm.
really bolster our case, in
Mm-hmm.
most cases. Yeah. Well,
Yeah. That is
yeah.
interesting. I will say that I actually had the opposite, and I know this
Yeah.
isn't as common, but mine was I was watching debates with Earthling Ed, and I just
Hmm.
felt like I did feel like ultimately the arguments were so good
Yeah.
that I didn't have an answer for them, and then I felt like, okay, well, I have a moral obligation to be vegan until I can find like a sufficiently good argument to not be vegan. And
Mm.
I actually didn't watch. I didn't watch any slaughterhouse footage until well after I was vegan. I don't think. I think I was
Oh,
at least vegan
wow.
for 2 months or so,
Mm.
maybe, before I ever saw like any part of Dominion or anything like that. And so,
Hmm.
and my empathy wasn't fully tapped in the
Hmm.
beginning. I was viewing it in much more analytical terms,
Hmm.
and it was, I think what it was removing animals from my life that actually removed that empathetic barrier and caused me to like slowly develop my empathy for animals. So I actually kind of had a
Oh,
reverse,
oh,
sort of a
interesting.
reverse situation. Yeah, yeah. I imagine that's probably not the more common of the two, especially after hearing you say that.
Like, and this is not just to, throw compliments in your direction,
Mm,
but I've noticed like a lot of the activists that I consider to be really intelligent
mm,
mentioned more of an entryway that was like based on, watching a debate or something and realizing, oh, I don't really have the arguments to
mm,
defend eating animals, and it's kind of like more of a thinking, like entryway rather than like
mm-hmm.
seeing it and being like, oh, this is fucked up and terrible and I shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting too that it takes that there's different entry points. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
different messages work on different people. I think that's also why it's important to have like this ecosystem of approaches as an
Yeah.
activist. Because it is different people are just going to respond to different things. So
Yeah, very true. One of my favorite videos that you made was something that I just feel like most activists just don't talk about that much. And it's just the video was called like different forms of activism for different personalities. And
yeah,
you talked about like basically like this passive activism that you can do. Like, say you're like really uncomfortable talking to people. Um, like get a sticker, do something like that. But can you tell um, can you tell me about some of those ways that people can be like a passive activist?
yeah. So I am like a huge proponent of t-shirt activism.
Hmm.
Uh, the reason being, so like when I'm thinking about like what is effective or whatever,
Hmm.
part of what I'm thinking is like, what is the time commitment? And buying a t-shirt is a very small time commitment, and then wearing the t-shirt is no time commitment because you have to wear a shirt in most
Yeah.
places. So like specifically like all my gym shirts now have vegan messages on them because I have to wear a shirt to the gym anyway. So it's not
Hmm.
costing me any extra time. It just cost me whatever it was to buy the shirt. And now every time I'm walking, like, and so usually I go to the gym, and oftentimes I'll walk somewhere afterwards and get like a smoothie bowl. And so now
Yeah.
the entire time I'm in the gym, people are seeing that shirt. That's probably like at least 50 people in the gym see that shirt
Hmm.
every time I go in. It's probably like another like 20 to 100 people see it when I go get like a smoothie bowl, just depending on how long I'm out, where I'm walking around to. And it's for nothing. It's basically
Yeah.
free at that point. And so like you're just a billboard walking around. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I think it matters what's on the shirt. I think that is important. I think almost anything is good. I think just if it just says vegan, I think that's great because there's a couple reasons. So there's something called the mere exposure effect. This just means the more often you're exposed to something, the more favorable you become to it. So if you see someone with a vegan shirt on, you understand that that person is a vegan probably. And so the more times you just like are around people who are vegan, the more favorably you're going to view veganism. But
Yeah.
also it shows it's not weird. It's normalized. If every time you walk
Hmm.
out you see like a person with a vegan shirt on, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, veganism. Veganism's a thing. That's not weird.
Hmm.
But if you're out and you see two people with a vegan shirt, then you got to be like, oh, what's sort of going on here? Now, if
Hmm.
you see three, then it's like, then you're like, okay, this is there's some groundswell. Something's happening here, right? If you walk out for a day and see 3 people with vegan shirts on, that would be wild. This is like the I don't know if you've seen the internet trend of like the owls. Like, how many owls do you need to see in one day before you start freaking out?
No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah. It's like okay, if you're walking around, how many owls do you see during the day before you're like, what is going on? And most people say about 3 owls is when they start to freak out, like 3 or 4. And so I think about that as the kind of like facetious thing here, but like if you were to see 3 people wearing a vegan shirt, it really does start to like send this message that this is like a common thing, it's a normal thing. And I am not someone like I know everyone's like, oh, what's like, what are these like systemic changes that are going to happen? It's like, taste, price, and convenience. Once those 3 things fall into place, like we're good. It's like, it's game over. I don't believe that. I want to believe it. I don't think it's the case. I think the thing that has to change is social norms. Those, of course, will help social norms change. But I think ultimately, if the social norms don't change, those 3 things aren't going to be enough. And so I'm always thinking of ways like how does this become more normal? How does this become like something that people aren't embarrassed to say that they're vegan, or they don't feel weird that they're vegan, and even just like that they stop making fun of vegans. Like that's an important part too, because so that vegans themselves aren't getting like hit by stuff, you know what I mean, and like suffering some sort of like psychic issues or psychological issues. So yeah, I think t-shirt activism is amazing. I also do t-shirt activism at the gym because like, so I would say I have like more muscle than the average person. And one of the stereotypes about vegans is you can't build muscle. So
Right.
I'm extra sure, like all my vegan shirts are like sleeveless. So I'm extra sure that I go out, I'm walking around, I'm like, hey, vegan here, you can build muscle while you're vegan, right? So I'm trying to like do multiple things at once with that.
Yeah, so I just want to do a note of caution.
Yeah.
Like, not everybody should do that one because I'll go to the gym and just look like a complete weenie, and I don't want people to see me promoting veganism.
That's funny. That's funny. But I will say, okay, even there, like, because I've had heard people say like, if you're like overweight as a vegan, like, don't really advertise your veganism because like that'll and I don't think that's true. I think that's I don't like that. I don't like that standpoint really at all. And I don't even think it's like beyond being like to me like incredibly insensitive. I think that I don't even think strategically it's smart because again, we also don't want like imagine if every vegan walking around was jacked. Then what are people going to think? Oh, okay, well in order to be a vegan I got to be jacked. If I don't look like that, then I shouldn't even like that's not for me. That's not like we want all shapes of vegans. We want to show people that vegans comes in all shapes and sizes. Vegan doesn't have to be connected with anything else. Vegan is a moral baseline, which means it doesn't need to be connected to any other specific group. This is like being anti-slavery. This is like thinking that women should have the right to vote, right? You're not just going to see like just only jack dudes think women should have the right to vote, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, some people would be surprised that there are vegans that are overweight. Just because they consider it to be like this malnourished kind of diet, whereas actually, like my fridge is like full of like so delicious ice cream bars. Like you can eat a lot of you can eat a lot of junk.
100%.
And of course I was joking. You should rep whatever you want to rep really. We do need a plethora of. We do need to show that there's diversity in the movement. I mean, I feel like the gay marriage movement was a great example of that. Gay rights, because when people were more out with being homosexual, they very quickly acceptance for gay marriage skyrocketed and gay rights in general. And you could just see like somebody like Dick Cheney came out in support of gay marriage because his daughter was lesbian and so it's really the same principle. Like, if I really don't like when people are sort of ashamed of the word vegan or even just like worried like, oh, this isn't going to work. We should be using the word plant-based because the word vegan is toxic to brands or something.
Yeah.
I think that's a mistake ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a tough spot. It's like there's so much or so much like anti-veganism out there, and I imagine it also matters where you live. So I will say it's easier for me because I live in a city that's fairly progressive. And so the anti-veganism isn't so prevalent here. Like obviously the right and left can both kind of be anti-vegan, but sort of for different reasons often. The left more so like, that like veganism is like colonialist or racist or something like that. But I don't really get that much. In fact, I get it very rarely here. So I would say like the anti-veganism here is pretty low. Most people look at it as like a moral virtue sort of thing, like not so much not obviously they don't look at it as a moral obligation or they'd probably be vegan, but they at least look at it as a moral virtue. So I do have a bit of an easier time. I don't know if I was in like rural Arkansas, if like wearing the vegan shirts would be as, as I get as positive feedback. Because I do, first off, a lot of people look at them. But over the course of wearing them for the past several years, I've had many people come up to me and been like, I like that shirt, or they'll fist bump me. Or like one guy, he was a vegetarian. He came up, he's like, can I take a picture of your shirt? And I was like, yeah, sure. And he's like, oh, my girlfriend's gonna love this. She's vegan. I'm like, oh, nice. I'm like, are you vegan? He's like, I'm vegetarian. So he's like, but I gotta get. He like went and like.
He knew what was coming.
Exactly.
What was he thinking?
So yeah, that was funny. But I've had like a lot of positive interactions like in person with people because of the shirts, and that just means that, that's just like the tip of the spear. That probably means that at least like 5 to 10 times as many people actually had a positive reaction, but just obviously aren't going to come up and tell everyone that they're having a positive reaction to the shirt. So yeah, that's a like a really easy passive form of activism.
Yeah, I like to think of the ways that a message can speak while I'm not, like a T-shirt or a sticker or something. Sometimes things like that where it's like when I leave here, if a message stays behind, it's still doing activism while I've left. And now I'm sleeping or watching TV or something. And technically, I'm still doing activism because I could be out there holding up a sign on a street corner for a couple hours, or the message could stay there for a while.
100%. Yeah. And that's why I like writing on stuff like, so I just want to say legal reasons. I don't condone anything that is illegal in your country. But like, writing on things like you can, oh my God.
He's like, hell yeah.
He came back. Yeah, I don't know why he came back in here. He was down with his mom and the other dog.
He agrees. He agrees.
my door doesn't. Okay, hold on. Let me get him out of here.
Yeah, no worries.
One sec, buddy. What are you doing?
It's so great doing interview show with animal rights activists. You always have animals coming in and talking. I actually wish we'd make them more a part of the interviews. That'd be good. My buddy Wayne, of course, Oliver's dog that he rescued from China, who's a good friend. I would like if we featured him more in our videos because Oliver's such a sweet boy and he's such an inspiration and inspires people just by showing up on camera because of his background. He was rescued from the dog meat trade. So, animals are our connection to, feeling these issues a little more and feeling the sense of urgency for these types of issues. Yeah, I was just talking about dogs there. But okay. Yeah, sorry, you were saying, yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess yeah. So you can, you can put stickers on various things. You can write on things, think about where people like often write things, right? You can like write things on bathroom stalls, or you can put up like little posters like on light poles and things like that in your city. You often see bands, things like that. You can put stickers on your car, like bumper stickers. I'd be careful with bumper stickers with maybe putting too many. Maybe kind of try to keep the message focused on one or two really good things you want to say related to veganism. All different kinds of places, wherever you see people typically write messages and however you see them typically write messages, if it's in public, consider that you can do those same things, but with a vegan message. So there's all sorts of things like that I think are just really quick passive things, but just be smart in the thing that you write, just be cognizant of what it is that you're writing there.
And
So,
where you are. So if, like,
mhm,
for instance, like maybe if you're on a college campus or something, maybe the messaging you're going for has something to do with labs,
mhm,
research, animal testing.
mhm.
Or, if it's like a coffee shop, maybe it's about dairy or,
Yeah,
those kinds of things. Like,
yeah.
yeah, so very cool. Yeah. Well, I think those are my questions, really,
Okay.
Justin. But is there anything that we didn't cover that you think we should, or do you want to talk about about the work that you're doing currently?
Um, as far as yeah, I mean, as far as things that we didn't cover that we should, I have no idea because I could. I
Yeah.
mean, I could just talk for like hours about like all sorts of subjects. Yeah,
Hmm.
right now what I'm doing, so I've refocused. I'm doing less video essays. I probably won't do any video essays for a little bit, because of, as I was saying earlier, and so I'm now more focused on doing street outreach. I'm going to try to hone my street outreach, really perfect that formula. I think I've got the first half down pretty well, actually, kind of what we went over. I like that as
Hmm.
my first, like, maybe my first third. And now I'm trying to perfect the middle and the ending. And so, like, one thing with the ending is I've started where typically I'm asking a lot of questions and letting them lead the conversation. I think there's is value at the end of monologuing a little bit. And so I've been working on what that monologue generally looks like. And I want it to like convey that what I was talking about before, like the symptoms versus the disease, and
Hmm.
kind of this commodification idea. And I really want to kind of have the monologue at the end cover that. And then what I'm working on beyond that is getting the more inspirational. So I don't just want to like communicate this. The person's like, yes, this is bad, etc. I want to like give them something at the end that's like, you can do this, you can be the change, you changing matters. And so that's kind of what I'm like, kind of trying to tighten up the end of the outreach, I guess.
Hmm.
So that's kind of what you'll be seeing. I did an interview with Dr. Faraz from Allied Scholars for Animal Protection.
Hmm.
That'll hopefully be up in a week or two. I
Very
do want to say
nice.
that I do really believe in Allied Scholars for Animal Protection, and so any college students who see this, if you're currently in college, any college campus can start an ASAP chapter. You
Hmm.
just have to reach out to Dr. Faraz. He's on Instagram, uh, YouTube, Facebook, all the things. So that's something I do want to put out there to people. That if you are in college and you want to get active, ASAP does have funding, and they already have like a structure and a bunch of people in all the different ASAP chapters around the country who you can talk to. You can tap them as resources and be like, how did you start it? What are the problems you ran into? What are the things that worked? So yeah, I'm probably going to be doing mostly outreach and probably definitely trying to boost ASAP's signal for a little bit here.
Are there, before we go, and I should start doing this, are there any activists that would be comfortable getting a shout out from you that you'd like to shout out as people that folks should follow? Like we've mentioned Natalie Fulton, we've mentioned Faraz, and
Mm-hmm.
is there anybody that you can think of that is just not getting the attention that they maybe should because they're doing great work?
Yeah, I think Lucy Munson.
Hmm.
I believe yeah, that's the name of her YouTube channel. Lucy Munson is
Yeah,
doing
I
really
think
good
she's in
outreach.
France.
Huh?
I think she's in France, French
No,
activist.
so she is French, but she is in
Okay.
Montana. I
Oh,
believe Montana.
okay.
Yeah, I think she's
Okay.
in Bozeman in the college town in Montana. But yeah,
Okay.
I believe she's French. And then I'm liking Vegan Power Lab.
Hmm.
He's in Europe somewhere. He's really producing a lot of outreach content, and I
Hmm.
like him too. He's got some sort of innovative ideas, and it's like he's like trying to I think push the envelope. He's like he's in a very learning mindset. It seems to me where he's like interested in trying different things. And so
Mm.
I really like what he's doing as well. And those are both YouTube channels with about like 1,000 subscribers.
Hmm.
So not that much smaller than me. But I
Hmm.
think yeah, they definitely could use a bigger audience for sure.
Yeah, and so people can find you at Debug Your Brain, right, on YouTube and
Yep.
all the socials. Is that right?
Yep. Just debug your brain. I think on on Instagram there's no spaces between it, but yeah,
And
that's it.
why Debug Your Brain?
So yes, when I first made my channel, I wasn't actually sure what it was going to be exactly. I had an idea that it was going to be more about psychology specifically,
Hmm.
and about biases and cognitive fallacies, or sorry, cognitive biases and fallacies and things like that. And it's gone more towards veganism, but with like some focus on psychology and teaching and that sort of thing. And so I kept the name because I think it still works. Uh, because I think one of the biggest things non-vegans need to do is debug their brain, is to
Hmm.
sort of like realize their blind spots and things like that. But that being said, so do vegans. So do I.
Hmm.
So does everyone. This is like it's an ongoing journey. You can never completely divest yourself of cognitive biases. Everyone is going to have some cognitive biases, but it's about how you work around those biases and how honest you are with yourself that they're there.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a perennial it's a perennial topic. It's a perennial thing that you have to like work on. But I just think that non-vegans need to work on it a little more.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, you're doing great work, Justin, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. And I hope that people will go follow you and follow your work because you're doing great work. So keep at it. And we'll
awesome.
talk again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation. Yeah.